ago, I was just a clinical psychologist, and one of my supervisees invited me along to a climate talk. Unsuspecting, I went along thinking, why was I bothering? This was a problem we had 100 years to solve. People were working on it. I had kids, career. Why would I bother going along to find out? I was working on a thing called acceptance and commitment therapy, which I was very enthusiastic about. And the essence of it was that you let difficult thoughts and feelings be there while taking action based on your values, particularly on the biggest, broadest, most important values of how you wanted to be remembered, what you wanted your life to be about. So that was my work, and very much focusing on what you do. It's not so much what you feel or what you think, it's what you do that makes a difference. And I was very passionately involved in that. But I went along to this talk, and I saw this after Guy's graph. It wasn't as far along at that point. It was still 2007. Well, I hadn't been a psychologist. I wanted to be a mathematician, so it actually meant a bit to me, that graph. I don't know, some people don't relate to graphs, but the thing that I related to was that the red line had fallen off the worst case predictions and was now heading in what looked like an exponential curve. And that alarmed me quite a bit. The thing that alarmed me more was I got onto this mailing list for David Spratt and Philip Sutton, who had started off writing a submission to the Garneau Inquiry, and as they had looked into the science to write their submission to the Garneau Inquiry, they had basically started writing a book. That book that ended up being called Climate Code Red, and they were writing in 2007. I think it came out in 2008. And what they were saying even then was that it was an emergency, that scientists were saying it was an emergency, and that really the scale and speed of changes we needed was like in a war. And the thing that frightened me almost, well, even more in some ways than their words, was hearing them saying that behind closed doors, scientists were already freaking out. They were talking amongst themselves, saying, should we buy land in the south of Tasmania? Should we buy land in the south of New Zealand? What's the best place to go? How can we keep our families safe with what's coming? And it was partly hearing those personal, private words that convinced me it was really, really serious. So I kept on going, trying to be a psychologist and trying to be a climate activist in my spare time. But after about 5 years, I took long service leave and I never went back, because I had firmly come to the view by then that we had 10 years to act. Well, that was actually 2010 to 2020 to really have avoided the worst. We were about halfway through that period. And so I consulted my values and decided if we had only 10 years, I wanted to spend it doing whatever I could. I still do a bit of psychology, but mostly now I work on climate as a volunteer. This is a bit fake. We were standing in front of the bulldozer, but there's nobody in the bulldozer. Sorry. But I was up there and helping set up a protest camp against the mine that was being built up there. So as a psychologist, of course, I was very interested in the question of the psychology, and one of the things that was very clear to me, and has been very clear all the way through, is that the message is just not reaching the public. Those scientists were talking privately to each other. David Spratt and Philip Sutton had written their book, which of course was read by some people, but probably not that many. And some of the reasons are very clear. I mean, over time, the campaign of lies has become well known. Merchants of Doubt came out with chapter and verse about how the lies of the fossil fuel industry were replicating the campaign of lies done by the tobacco industry, even using the same scientists. So that was clear. I get annoyed when people say that this campaign of lies is something to do with right-wing values, because in fact, right-wing or left-wing, there is nobody who goes, oh yes, I'm a liar. I line up with the liars. You know, I'm going to go to my grave going, oh, I was such a clever liar. No, there's no right-winger who actually values lies. So this campaign of lies is not really a right-wing campaign, it's just a campaign of lies. The other big problem, of course, was scientific reticence, that scientists naturally and appropriately are trained to talk without emotion, to put all the uncertainties in, and be very cautious. It's partly training and it's partly culture. That there is pressure on scientists not to step outside the mainstream. You'll get less grants and you'll be in trouble with your organisation. You'll maybe lose your job if you step too far outside the main line. So this is James Hansen, one of the very eminent climate scientists who first sounded the alarm and who was very senior inside NASA, but who in recent times has quit, and this is him getting arrested because he's so frustrated with his scientific papers and his testimony in Congress and various places being ignored. He now feels he has no choice. And he's trying to get the message out also with things like when he puts out a scientific paper, now he always gets 20 or 30 co-authors to show it's not just his loony opinion, it's actually a widely shared view. And he then does a video with his granddaughter, Sophie, and tries to explain it in ordinary words. So he's realised himself that the message is not getting through. The bit that I was most interested in as a psychologist was what I would describe as cherry-picking the psychology. There's an incredible disinformation campaign about the psychology going on, as well as a disinformation campaign about the science. And this came to a head. I don't know how many people read The Uninhabitable Earth. It was in the New York Magazine. 2 million people around the world did read it. And it was written by David Wallace Wells, who was deputy, or I think still is deputy editor. He'd interviewed dozens of scientists. He'd made a very serious effort to find out really exactly what the situation was and then put it into everyday language. And he put it into everyday language. He calls it peering beyond scientific reticence. And of course, when you put it into everyday language, what scientists are saying is dead scary. And I think myself that he did a wonderful service to humankind by putting these terrible dangers into everyday language. But the very next day, the climate activists, climate campaigners, and climate scientists were putting the boot into this guy. And they were saying, oh, he's got a few things wrong. Well, he had got at least one thing wrong. But the main thing they were giving him, a jolly good kicking over, is fear doesn't work. That he should not have told people how bad it was. Not in ordinary, scary language. And I was already struggling to write this booklet, Don't Mention the Emergency, but at that stage I felt I was never going to finish it. I was having terrible trouble. But when I saw this debate going on, I just felt I had to finish it. There was someone who wrote an article accusing him of writing disaster porn. He was under terrible attack, and yet I think he is one of the journalists in the world that is having the courage to really speak out. So he makes a very good point, I think, that at this point in history there is more risk of people not being scared enough than of people being too scared. And if there's even a 1% chance we set off a chain reaction that could end the human race, then why not we tell people that? People have a right to know at this point in history what's going on.
Before you move on, Jay, is that really New York Magazine or the New Yorker Magazine?
It's a New York Magazine. It's not New Yorker.
I'd not heard of that one. Okay, thank you.
Okay. I'm 99% sure. Anyway, you Google up Uninhabitable Earth and it's all over the place. You can find it on Wikipedia. Because this debate just raged and there's dozens and dozens of articles on each side. So I'm not going to go through all the psychology because the strange thing that's happened is in about a year, I think a lot of the debate about the psychology has just dropped out. I used to summarise all the psychology research, but I think the clearest summary is just if you look at every public health campaign in recent times, you see the same formula. Think of the cigarette packets, think of drink driving, think of seat belts. And they all have the same formula. Tell people really clearly and in reasonably scary ways that there's a terrible danger that could apply to them, and then tell them what to do. And there's meta-analyses and all sorts of things showing that actually that works fine. That's why they use it all the time. Now, there's no research on this one. How do you tell an emergency message? There's no research on it because no one even begins to debate it. If a fire is approaching your little town, and it's one of those really big ones where you should stay and defend, the fire chief will say, massive fire is approaching from the north. This is a really big fire. Do not stay and defend. Evacuate now by the southern road. Imagine a debate in the back room there going, oh, look, it's a really bad fire, we better not tell them because fear doesn't work. You never would hear that. And so I think all this stuff about, denial and a lot of 99% of what's been written about the psychology of the climate emergency, I think was written by people who didn't understand that it was an emergency. And they thought we had to just get people like me off the couch and along to some meeting where we just had to put a few solar panels on, and if we could get people excited, then that was fine. That has a lot of merit. I think it's something that's not urgent. But once it's an emergency, there's only one form of messaging that has ever been used. Tell people the danger, tell them what to do. So that's what we're going to do for the rest of the evening. And look, sadly the first part is kind of depressing and scary. I will tell you that now. So we will be sort of going on a bit of a downward spiral for not more than 20 minutes. I'll just get out my watch so I don't give you the pain for too long. And then we'll be going up, because the exciting thing is I really think that there is a way through this now. I would have to say that for a while I wasn't sure, but I'm now very optimistic. So here we go, down. This is the booklet. You can download it, but you can also give me $5 and take one. So, time to tell the truth. For several years now I've been talking about climate emergency. The interesting thing with Extinction Rebellion, which is what I'm part of now, is they actually talk about the climate and ecological emergency, because there's parts of how we're destroying the planet that are not directly to do with climate, or not even really to do with climate, just like the plastic that's now in breast milk and just about everything, like killing off the bees with pesticides. Some of the bees are dying because of climate, but some of them are dying because of pesticides. And all these things are things that in the end are very dangerous for us. So now I say climate and ecological emergency. And one of the things I've been focusing on, especially in these last few years, is just trying to encourage people. I wrote this to reach out to the big groups and to the Labor Party mainly, and also to some extent to the Greens, and try and encourage people just to say climate emergency instead of climate change. There's a history of our opponents deciding, well, researching and finding that saying climate change made it seem like a less urgent and less severe problem even than saying global warming. So they advised the Republicans in the US to always say climate change, don't say global warming. And research since then has backed it up. If you say global warming, people are more alarmed, more willing to act. If you say climate change, it feeds so nicely into the meme that says climate is always changing. Every time you say climate change, climate is always changing. Climate change, climate is always changing. So, great. It's surprising how hard it is to get people to shift, or has been, to shift to saying climate emergency. Philip and David were arguing for this back in 2007, 2008. I remember a big fight we had at the Grassroots Climate Summit in Canberra in about 2008 or 2009. And that's with the even grassroots group going, oh, we can't call it an emergency, that's too scary. So it's been a really long, hard battle just to even shift the word. We're getting there though. But imagine if we had started back in 2007. This is just a little bit more psychology. The Overton window is the central space of the policy debate. It's what's regarded as sort of the sensible centre of what's going on in society. And on either side are views that are, at some particular point in history, regarded as unthinkable. So, at the time Al Gore's film came out, the idea that scientists were lying or that it really wasn't happening would probably have been almost unthinkable. He said it, people believed it, oh my gosh, the level of public concern went right up. On the other hand, it was only a year or two later that David and Philip were trying to say that it was actually we needed to declare an emergency and do an emergency transition, World War II scale. Both of those ends, probably, by about 2006, 7, 8, were unthinkable, and the sensible centre said, yeah, it's happening and we've got 100 years or 50 years at least, we'll just do a bit at a time. Now what happened is our opponents went hard on their bit. They did the thing with the emails, which they thought which tried to demonstrate that scientists were lying. every time they open their mouths, scientists are lying, it's not happening, it's climate's always changing, and they stuck relentlessly to their message. They never compromised, they never tried for the middle ground, they went hard on theirs, and what did? We came right down to meet them. There's still a hashtag, climate change is real. Real, not real, real, not real, real, not real. That was the debate we've had for 10 years. And it's partly because we would not move to the other end. If we had stayed there and gone, emergency, World War II scale transition, emergency, World War II scale transition, in the end they would have been going, oh, it's not an emergency. And we would have had that window right up here. Instead we've had it go right down, oh, I could use my pointer, here we go, technology. We've had it go right down here because they fought very hard on the psychology, and we didn't. Now's the time to drag it up this end. It's not that hard. We have to do what they did. Be clear and unequivocal. So, people have been trying. So this is Ban Ki-moon back in 2007. The Age, from time to time, even as early as 2011. Scientists, regularly. Naomi Klein, relatively recently. Peter Garrett, after he left politics. And not very much publicised, but even Bill Shorten. This is him at the press club criticising Turnbull, and Turnbull was still Prime Minister. What about the people like Turnbull who know better but are ignoring the emergency in front of us? We're running out of time to act on climate change. Climate change is not business as usual. It's really quite strong words. And yet we still have people going to the Labour Party and saying, will you stop Adani? Well, the thing I want to ask the Labour Party is, will you declare a climate emergency? And it's partly about the language. If we ask for very little, we'll get very little. We'll leave the Overton window just sitting there right where it is. One of the part of that campaign, which I'll tell you about as we go on, has involved getting people, politicians, to commit to support the declaration of a climate emergency, and one of the ones who has is Jed Carney, who won in the Batman then now Cooper by-election, and she promised to support the declaration of a climate emergency, and she actually has. So this is her at federal conference, not talking about the declaration of a climate emergency, but at least using emergency language. There it is, the recent IPCC report. Ooh, wrong one. Okay, getting excited. Okay, the recent IPCC indicates we are experiencing a climate emergency. So she's used climate emergency quite a lot in Parliament. And the language is starting to shift. So I'm only saying that because the important thing I think when going to see politicians is to not use language that's weaker than what they're already using. So if we wanted to talk in strong language, obviously we use the word emergency, but how do we get a message across in a way that is persuasive? So how do we do the dangerous approaching bit? I personally don't like to start with anything about 1 degree, 2 degrees. I mean, probably for this audience, you've got so much context for 1 degree and 2 degree that you hear 2 degrees and you go, oh my God, that's terrible. The average person though, I mean, it's probably 10 degrees warmer today than it was last week. And, you know, it means I've got different clothes on, but it's not any kind of catastrophe. So talk about half a degree for an average person means absolutely nothing. The other thing that we know about the human brain is you can actually watch on a scan someone making a decision and you can see the emotional bits shifting first down the back, and then, oh, the reason I want to buy that car is because it's cheaper. It's 99% of the time we're very guided by emotion for survival. We give our attention to the stuff that is relevant because it's dangerous, exciting, infringing, making us angry. So, how do we do it without using numbers? I think we just start from the Earth is already too hot. Most people know the Earth's already too hot, one way or the other. Anchor it in whatever they agree with, because there is no doubt the Earth is too hot. Wherever we look, we've got coral bleaching, swimming pools falling into the sea, of mass migration and conflict arising out of food and water shortages. It's definitely too hot. So the easy thing, once you've got that foundation, is that it actually removes a whole lot of complexity about carbon budgets. How many figures have we numbed people's brains with about 1.5, 565 gigatons, 30%, 2040, 2030, all that sort of stuff. If the Earth is already too hot, what's our remaining carbon budget? That's right. It's zero. It's zero or less. We overshot a while back, so we don't have a remaining carbon budget. Doesn't matter which figures you pick. If the Earth's too hot, we don't have a carbon budget. How can we possibly have one? If we spend all that money, we actually don't have any. There's no use talking about our budget. And yes, in fact, we don't have any money. We've spent our thing on the credit card, so we're going to have to pay that back first. So another really simple thing that follows from this that is quite easy to explain without a whole lot of figures is that if it's already too hot, we've got to stop making it hotter, we've got to start making it cooler. That means we've got to take some of that heating blanket down and stick it back in the earth somehow. The other thing that obviously we've got to do is every bit that we're going to put up from now on, unless we want the earth hotter than it is now, we're going to have to that bit down and go, put it back under the ground. So that's every day from now on, the coal, gas, oil, everything that we do that's going up. Somebody, either us or our kids, is going to have to get it down again. So you may as well add that straight onto the cost. All this stuff about zero by 2050, our carbon budget for this and our carbon budget for that. This is what Kevin Anderson says about the IPCC carbon budgets and their report. And what he's talking about is bioenergy carbon capture and storage in this particular quote. To make it look like we've still got a remaining carbon budget for 1.5, bad though 1.5 will be, you have to make a whole lot of quite difficult assumptions, quite problematic assumptions. You've got to make a whole lot of assumptions that tipping point's not kicking in, but the other thing you've got to do is assume that we can sort of overshoot, we can keep on putting some more up, because in the second half of the century we've got this thing called bioenergy carbon capture and storage that's going to come along and just stick it all in, which means we're going to grow this massive amount of forests and vegetation. We're going to cut that all down, we're going to transport that all to thousands and thousands and thousands of places where it's going to get burned. We're going to capture the CO2 as it comes out the chimney, we're going to put that into a truck or a train or something and transport it to some place where we're going to stick it in a hole. And the chances of actually working at scale is what Kevin Anderson is referring to as a carton-sucking fairy godmother. Again, it's pretty technical, but the simple bottom line is that it's already too hot. We just got to get to zero as fast as we possibly can. So that's why I get annoyed when people say we've got 12 years to act. When you say we've got 12 years, something to a politician, what do they think?
Through 4 election cycles.
That's right, 11 years to do nothing, that's what they think. Why would any of us go around saying 12 years, something? We haven't got 12 minutes. Remember? We're already too hot now. How have we got 12 years? 12 years to do what? All we can sensibly say is we've got to do everything we possibly can as fast as we possibly can. It's the only sensible response. So it's as though we're paddling down the river on a beautiful day, bubbling brook, turn around the corner, current's getting faster, there's a roar in the distance, turns out we're heading for a waterfall. The current may catch us and take us over before we can do anything, but if we paddle hard to the shore, maybe we can stop ourselves. But we don't go, oh, I've got 12 minutes to act, or I've got, we paddle hard for the shore and hope we can make it. Because that's sort of where we are now. There are forces at work, even at 1 degree, that can keep us going hotter, not to mention temperature lags and things, and the effects of the aerosols that will drop out. And look, this is not exact, but it's a figurative representation of the fact that we've already got a bit of momentum. If we get past 2 degrees, we'll have more momentum. Somewhere around 2, 3, 4, we're just pretty much in free fall. We're not going to be able to get it back from there. Now people say, well, when's this going to happen? Well, I think the answer is because we don't exactly know. It's like that boulder. It's like that boulder. And we know the little tree is going to give way one day, and we know once it gives way, that person is going to be in a really bad situation, and the chances of stopping that boulder are going to be very slim. We don't know exactly when it's going to go. We don't want to find out though. And I won't go through all the scary things that we're doing, but ocean currents is one. We're slowing down this great big ocean conveyor belt, which is one of the things that scientists have said we must avoid doing at all costs. It's already 15% slower. And we have no idea how to reverse it. We don't really know how to refreeze the ice on Greenland. We don't really know how to refreeze those big ice sheets. And we definitely don't know how to restart the ocean currents once they slow down. So, like I say, scientists are trying to tell us something. This is one of the clearer and more recent attempts. And what we see here is that, so there's 1.5. Dangerous now cuts in at 1.5, not at 2. There's been this other category we haven't heard a lot about, but it's been around for a while, catastrophic. That's where lots and lots of people die and really, really bad stuff happens. That's sort of centred on somewhere around 4 degrees, 3.5, 4 degrees. But recently they've introduced this other category called existential. Now I did a little poll of university-educated people visiting my house. I asked them, what do you think existential means? And 10 out of 10 said, is it something to do with existentialism? Well, it sort of is, but that's not what they're trying to tell us. They're trying to tell us we're facing an existential threat, as in human civilization breaks down and just about everyone on Earth dies. That's what they're trying to convey. Unfortunately, they're using a word that 10 out of 10 people visiting my house anyway don't actually understand. This is, you have to be a graphic person to like this graph, but I do, because it's got probability going up the vertical axis there. So I'll just give you a brief interpretation. What it's trying to tell us is that there's a high probability that we can stay under 1.5 if we pull 3 levers. But the key is, what are the 3 levers? Zero carbon emissions emergency speed, as low as we can go on short-lived pollutants at emergency speed, that's methane, black soot, hydrofluorocarbons, that sort of thing, and massive drawdown as fast as we can go. That's our 3 levers. If we go slower, we're going to be somewhere between catastrophic and existential. And the reason it sort of flattens out there is because there's so many uncertainties. We don't really know exactly what will happen, but the most likely is catastrophic if we move at moderate speed, and existential if we go really slow. So, Hans Schellnhuber was the founding director of the Potsdam Institute, advisor to Angela Merkel and the European Union and the Pope. Again, recently retired and probably speaking out a little bit more freely, although people have pointed out that he has been speaking out in forums, not so much in written papers, for quite some time. So this is from the forward of this one. This is David Spratt still writing. It's called What Lies Beneath, and it's about how the IPCC is set up to underestimate, how its methodology, not for any sort of evil intent of the scientists, but the methodology is set up so that it will, almost without exception, underestimate. And the interesting thing is that David Spratt obviously is a very expert commentator who's read a lot and followed the science very closely, but he's got Schellnhuber for writing the forward. And so this very strong quote comes from Schellnhuber in the forward to that book. We're reaching the end game where very soon humanity must choose between taking unprecedented action, unprecedented in wars and certainly nothing like business as usual, or accepting it's been left too late and bear the consequences. So we're almost at the bottom, because this is another really scary one actually in the paper, that we could set off that cascade of tipping points that'll take us out of control, even below 1.5, and I just told you how hard staying under 1.5 is going to be. That's what the waterfall diagram looks like in a slightly more technical form. It's basically saying that we're sort of here, and if we work really hard, we can sort of go back up the hill and be all right. And if we don't work really hard, we're going to go over the waterfall. Simplified summary. So, we know about the corals that are dying. All sorts of creatures are becoming extinct, including this little cute mammal. Insects are dying. Bees. Essential components of the web of life. We hear about the big fires. We don't hear so much about the heatwave events, which in Europe have killed tens of thousands of people. Even in Australia, the heatwave killed more than the Black Saturday fires. And people say we're in the midst of the sixth mass extinction. But what does that really mean? Well, the last one, it took 10 million years for the land to recover and 2 million for the oceans. If you're hanging around waiting for things to recover in your bunker, you've got a long wait. So this is now hitting right to the bottom. Could humans become extinct? Well, the most likely thing is that a few survive, but we could all go. We're already seeing the start of breakdown, and this is a wall that India has built around Bangladesh, because Bangladesh is going under with the sea level rise, so a lot of their crops are already getting inundated with salt water. They've got 80,000 troops patrolling the border, and in 1 year they shot 800 people going over. So it's not like this stuff is happening in the future. This is happening now. I can give you more examples. There was a drought in Syria that preceded the civil war. 3 years of drought, 1 million farmers displaced to the capital. Apparently the South Americans heading for the US border, a lot of them were coffee farmers who had their coffee crops destroyed by some pest that usually was killed off by cold nights, but there was no more cold nights. So there's this story that's not being really told about a lot of these conflicts and mass migrations that are already making so many people suffer. And we don't really have a picture of the breakdown of civilization, so I had to use one from a computer game. But scientists are trying to tell us that we're risking the breakdown of human civilization. What is that going to be like? Not much fun. And similarly, a world where most people are dead. We haven't hardly got images of it, except maybe the road or Mad Max. And like, having heard from the scientists, they were looking at land in Tasmania. What did I do? I went and got land in Tasmania. And, imagine how you can go down there and grow some veggies and things. And someone said, okay, you take your kids to Tasmania, are you going to give them machine gun lessons too? Because if human civilization breaks down, the fact that you've got a title to land in Tasmania, who's going to care? So, it's sort of good news and bad news. What it means is there really isn't an individual solution. I can't fix it by going to Tasmania. So, we've got some other ways of fixing it, don't worry. But first of all, I think it's worth just pausing, because I always feel so bad, really, to do this part of the talk. It is just, really depressing. And I guess the thing I'm wondering is, how many of you knew all this stuff before? How many of us are hearing some of it for the first time? What I suggest, even though you're very spread out, I don't know, is it possible for you to, I don't know, I guess you could just talk to the person nearest. I was going to say talk to someone you don't know. Maybe just talk to the person nearest. So we've just got one person, we've got a couple of people who might have to move towards each other, and maybe 3 there or 2 there. I'm just thinking to spend a couple of minutes on this, because this is emotional stuff, really, isn't it? And I think it's worth just taking an emotional breather to say what the emotional impact of hearing this stuff is before we gather ourselves and move on. So I'll just give you a few minutes for that. So, one of the things that is most interesting to me is that it's obviously fantastic having Beyond Zero emissions and all sorts of techie people working on the solutions. I have to say it was very good. After a couple of years of watching the David Spratman Sutton thing back in 2007, 2008. About 2009, BZE sprang up, and I think the stationary energy came out in 2010. And it was such a relief to have people saying we can solve this at a technological level. I think, though, the thing that's made people depressed more recently is not so much the question of whether we can solve it at the level of technology, it's the question of whether we can solve it at the level of politics. That's what's become really depressing over the last 10 years. So, my proposition is that really, in some ways, the paramount and first aspect of the solution is a psychological one, that we have to somehow move society into emergency mode. So this is the psychological state that comes upon you as you're sitting around the kitchen table, chatting about this and that, working out how you're going to pay the bills, working out who's going to take the kids to whatever's happening tomorrow, and then the stove catches fire. Suddenly everything else is forgotten, you're focused on that fire till you put it out or you escape or you've done whatever you can. And that's the shift we need in society. We're out of time for doing it a bit and a bit of this and a bit of that, dawdling along. We move into emergency mode, or we can pretty much forget it, that's my opinion. And the good thing about emergency mode is that your entire capacity is focused on one problem. Another good thing about it is that in an emergency, you actually do see society come together. And see these people out there, they're cleaning up the streets in Brisbane, and they're all muddy. But you can see there's something actually special going on. There's something quite uplifting about working with others to do something that's really important, even if it involves getting dirty, even if it's not easy. So that's why I like to call it climate emergency, because it includes the idea of the problem, but it almost includes the idea of the solution. When you declare an emergency, get everyone working on the problem together, fairly, equitably, and fast. There's something uplifting about that. And you still hear journalists go, oh, we can't put climate on the front page every day. Well, hardly ever, because people will get bored. And I'm pretty sure there's nobody here that's old enough to remember the war. But if you think about when there's big terrorism events, and it's front page day after day after day after day, because when it's life and death, people actually do want to hear what the next episode of the story is. I think when people get that the climate emergency is life and death, it's life and death for our human civilization, I hope we can persuade journalists that it should be front page every day. The other thing about this, which I forgot to say, is when the river is rising and the sandbags are needed to protect the town, you don't hear people go, oh, well, I'm not going to do it because I'm right wing, or I'm not going to do it because I'm left. When it's life and death, actually everyone does the sandbags together. So that's another thing that's very important about actually being brave enough to say, look, this is now about life and death. It's about survival. It's everyone in it together. So, I think we do have to say a society-wide mobilisation. World War II scale doesn't tend to go down very well, but we find that a speed and scale never before seen in peacetime, which is, broadly speaking, the same thing, works fine. But you need to be honest, like, it's not going to be just a bit of this and a bit of that and we still keep on changing our iPhones every second year. It is going to be a big change, like you see in wartime, where you don't bring in a car tax, you bring in a regulation that just says, sorry car factory, you're not making cars anymore, you're making tanks. Sorry ordinary people, you're not driving anymore for fun, we need the petrol for the war effort. There has to be regulation. There has to be things like it happens in war with rationing, where everyone gets the same share of butter or whatever it is that's being rationed. It has to be not something that the rich keep on driving and the poor pay the petrol tax and can't afford to drive anymore. The thing that makes people cohesive in a war, in the home front, is that things are fair. The rationing is fair. It applies to everyone. It's not that the poor suffer and the rich just keep on doing whatever they like. Now, it's very interesting following the climate mobilisation. These are people who picked up David and Philip's ideas, or well, they're not just theirs, but the ideas of many, that they needed a World War II scale mobilisation. And they started this campaign in 2015 where they were asking people to pledge to mobilise. And we were watching them going, they're saying the right thing, but we cannot see how this is going to work in Australia. Well, it certainly did work in America though, because literally within months of them launching this very powerfully uncompromising campaign, what they say is that they found straight away that as they went out with a strong message, people that they needed came to them. And one of the people that came to them was one of the big donors inside the Bernie Sanders primary campaign. And so they were able to get right inside the Bernie Sanders campaign. He was initially just asking for a carbon tax. But they managed to shift his ideas, so he was asking for a World War II style mobilisation. And again, literally within months, when he lost the primaries, there was this deal done where they were fighting over the Democrats' platform, and Hillary's crew were putting in all this stuff about gas is good and gas is a transition fuel. And to keep Bernie's crew from just completely jumping ship, they put in a World War II type, which is a bit weird, but to World War II something, national mobilisation to save civilisation. It's in the Democrats' platform. If Hillary had won, that would be the platform, and she was also committed to holding a climate emergency conference within the first 100 days of office. So this is what they won in less than a year of uncompromising campaigning. And of course now, they're going on from strength to strength. The Green New Deal is basically a World War II style mobilisation under a different name. And Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez is this wonderful young Democrat who's pushing it through. Not through yet, but apparently it has really quite wide support across the political spectrum. Who would have thought that something could so quickly become mainstream, where it could get legislated? Strong language has done it in, 3 or 4 years. And she's a wonderful communicator. So this is where BZE and I'm sure the talks that you're more familiar with sit. We know an enormous amount now about the technologies that are needed, and pretty much all of them are just going to make life better. So the technology, I think, is not where people are getting pessimistic. On the other hand, I think we do need to add to the zero emissions message. It's the same thing that BZE added many years ago when they changed from zero emissions now to beyond zero emissions. So we've got to remember to always talk about drawdown. Just the idea that we're in overshoot, so we have to go backwards. And there are all sorts of natural methods for doing it, as well as some not so natural. And James Hansen says that if we move fast, if we get to zero really fast, then natural drawdown, reforestation, regenerative agriculture can do a large part of the job. So again, these are all the things that we want to do anyway, if we hurry. If we don't hurry, that looks like roots on the plant, but that's the fungi-like thing.
Mycorrhiza. Mycorrhiza.
That's it. That stuff. This is the good stuff that should be growing under the soil, making our soil rich, gathering all the nutrients and putting it into the food. When we blitz our soil with herbicides, pesticides, and every other side, and we plough it up and chop all that up, that's partly why we're all taking magnesium and selenium supplements, because the goodness in the soil is going, as well as the carbon. So if we move fast, we can do all that good stuff. If we don't, we're into what Hansen now in his Sophie Fizzy videos calls the young people's burden. That's where we've got to spend trillions and trillions and trillions of dollars on making machines, and by then we're in a race against time. There's so many feedback loops operating, putting more and more into the air that the trees and the farming can't fix it, and we're building machines. Apparently this one is about enough to suck down the carbon dioxide from one house for a year. So you can only begin to imagine what a building program we'd have to do if we're going to do it with machines. And I already described BECS to you. We better hurry, that's my view. Now the interesting thing, and I think this is again a very helpful thing in terms of our campaigning, it's sort of good and sort of depressing, that apparently we're also facing a soil emergency. So the United Nations says we only have 60 harvests left. Worldwide, that's not in Australia. Worldwide. We are destroying our soil so fast that in 60 years they actually won't feed us anymore. So we actually have to change everything about how we're farming, even if we didn't have a climate crisis. And I think that's kind of good. Because it's very hard to argue, oh, we shouldn't fix the soil. We don't care if we have no food. I mean, it's not going to, pathological options. I like to think this bit's not going to be controversial. We'll see. Famous last words. Okay, so how are we going to get there? We've been writing reports, we've been signing petitions. I spent 6 months with some other people in big organisations organising the People's Climate March. We've been doing grassroots organising. I don't know how many elections now. I've helped run a vote climate campaign. I think it's true to say it's not going to get us there fast enough. But fortunately, some great minds have come along to help us. And one of them is Erica Chenoweth, a political scientist who examined most of the big social movements in the last century, looked at non-violent and violent uprisings, found that basically the non-violent ones were much more likely to succeed than the violent ones. The violent ones, even if they succeeded, often led to chaos or totalitarianism. And the most exciting bit about her work is that she has found historically that quite often you can get these massive changes, even the fall of a regime, with just 1% of the population really working hard at it. In fact, the biggest proportion she found that was needed in one of them was 3.5. It's not like we've got to get everybody psyched up and coming to meetings like this in their precious evenings. We only need somewhere between 1 and 3%. And so I found that very encouraging when I heard it. This last bit comes from Roger Hallam, who's one of the people involved in starting Extinction Rebellion in the UK. And I just felt elated when I heard him say this. If you look at history, you find that most of those big changes had lots of people in the streets, but were getting nowhere until a very small number were prepared to risk arrest and go to jail. So his view is that 500 in jail, or maybe even less, 5,000 or so arrested, is more politically effective than 1 million on the streets. And the thing that he said that made me very happy is it's so much easier to organise. It's very, very doable. So, this is the good news. And the other bit of good news is an idea. I don't know whether it's Paul Gildings that I heard about it from him. He's a wonderful apocalyptic optimist. He wrote a book called The Great Disruption back in about 2010 or 11. But most recently he was talking about social tipping points and just saying the same way there's climate tipping points, there's social tipping points. And you can keep going on, you can't detect any change. You're campaigning. This is like us in Darwin handing out stuff about the climate emergency in 2007, 2008, and people are just going, leave me alone. Then suddenly it changes. And you can't, it's the same as that boulder with the little tree. You can't really see when it's about to change, but then suddenly, boom, it just changes. And I think the school strike is an obvious example. It started with just Greta. And I had a friend ring me up and say, oh, you've got to watch this Greta from Sweden. She's amazing. I said, I can't really understand why you're getting so excited. It's one kid outside the parliament. Anyway, it was someone whose antenna were much better than mine, who had picked this somehow was going to be the thing that set off this enormous change. So the last school strike had 1.5 million around the world. And that's really, again, the same thing, in less than 6 months. She was starting in August last year. Quite extraordinary. So, it's all sorts of changes that, on the face of it, looking back, you'd say they should have been easy, but they weren't easy, and they didn't happen until people got arrested. Civil rights in the US, even votes for women, like it should have been a no-brainer, right? But it wasn't until really very respectable women were getting arrested and one in fact threw herself under horses at Ascot that women got the vote. They were chaining themselves to buildings, and do you know what people were saying? They were saying, oh, I sort of agree with what they're saying, but I don't like the methods. Martin Luther King, very brave. And the story, it's really worth listening to watching some of the videos on YouTube about the Freedom Riders. These were people after America had officially ended segregation, but but still there was all this segregation happening down south. 13 people, all different colours, ages and faith groups, set off on a bus to go from the north down to the south where this was all happening, and they were going against what some areas required. And they met with the most horrific violence. They had the Ku Klux Klan beating them up while the police stood aside and watched. They had the bus burned. And they went down and down and down very bravely, but already sort of injured and really quite scared, until they got to a point down south where the bus driver wouldn't take them anymore, the bus drivers, because it was obviously dangerous for the bus drivers as well. And because they had been so incredibly, had suffered so much, they actually gave up at that point. But from all over America, others came to take up from exactly that point, that very dangerous point where they were just heading into the deep south. And in one of the videos, there's an amazing statement from one of the people who did that, who's now talking from the present. And he says that he was the only one from his family who had ever been to university, and he was right at his final exams. But when he saw what happened to these people, he just felt that he had to go. So he left for his exams to go and join the bus. And first of all, it was 13, and then it was hundreds. And they filled up the prisons until eventually they just stopped trying to require black and white to sit separately and so on. Example of just one person who's willing to go to jail, who made a big difference. He bid into a gas auction for a fake bidding. Ended up spending 21 months in jail and writing letters from jail that inspired thousands. We had our own with Jono, who wrote a fake press release, pretending that the ANZ was withdrawing funding from the Whitehaven Coal project, and crashed the share price of Whitehaven Coal by 1,314 million, and in theory, was sentenced to 1 year, 8 months in jail, but actually was given a bond and didn't serve it. But again, it inspired thousands with his stand. So there's lots of examples. This is people blockading Downer, who was one of the firms that was going to build the Adani mine, until quite brave people blockaded their asphalt works on a regular basis and they pulled out. This was the Franklin River blockade. People would paddle upstream in their inflatable dinghies and blockade, all get arrested, and then the next lot would come up, do their non-violent direct action training, get in their little dinghies and go up. And it was just like a production line. As one lot got arrested, the next lot would get trained and go up the river until the same thing, until the jails were pulled down there in Tasmania. All sorts of beautiful forest projects we've had. And gas, that's the Bentley blockade, which won. Amazing young people doing all sorts of protests with the coal ports and the coal mines. Adani, of course. Beautiful photo. But the other thing that's happened in Australia is what was almost like an accident. It came out of our view that we needed to declare a climate emergency. So this is what happened when we started using strong language in 2016. Because we've been watching climate mobilisation and just thinking how it just wasn't going to work in Australia. And it was in 2016 we realised that what we do in Australia is not pledge to mobilise, we declare an emergency. That's what we do all the time, with floods, fires. So we started campaigning to declare a climate emergency, and one of the things we did was get candidates to pledge to support the declaration of a climate emergency. So when the council elections came around, we were getting all the council candidates to pledge. And we were thinking of it as actually, outreach to the political parties. We were thinking the council candidates, if they were Labor, might talk to the Labor Party, and if they were Greens, would talk to the Greens. So we didn't expect much more than that to happen, but what happened was that in Darebin we actually got 2/3 of the council candidates to support, no, half of the candidates, 2/3 of those who were elected supported the declaration of a climate emergency. And in the very first council meeting, they went ahead and declared a climate emergency. And from then it's just almost run faster than I mean, people are working on it, but it's been really ultra hard. This was actually the third election we campaigned with the Darwin Council to try and get something to happen, anything. And then suddenly, everything got easy. So they declared an emergency, they wrote an emergency plan, they ran an emergency conference, they influenced some other councils, and then when Trump got in, instead of Hillary in the US, they picked up the council's campaign, called it Local First, and they started getting councils to declare in America, or in fact whole cities, like Los Angeles. So it started just to spread around the world. But it was the same sort of experience for us, that as soon as we started saying really strongly and clearly, it's an emergency, we've got to declare an emergency, we just found things started to happen. That's Trent McCarthy, one of the Greens councillors, and someone who's been very active in trying to get this stuff happening for a long time. So, but the really exciting bit is Extinction Rebellion. So when I was writing this, I was writing that stuff about existential risk and that we've got to talk about conflict and mass migration and all that sort of thing. But the thing I could not for the life of me think of was how to make it a catchy slogan that is around everyone's going to die unless we do something. I just couldn't come up with anything. And then, so when I saw Extinction Rebellion, I went, yes, this is it. Everyone's going to die unless we rebel. 2 words, I thought that is a pretty succinct summary. So Extinction Rebellion came out of this group Rising Up in the UK, and they'd been campaigning for a couple of years. And the thing that they were specialising in was actually using this very visual, disruptive style. So quite a small number, say, of protesters, that this is just 2 or 3 with flares. This is Roger Hallam, the one I mentioned earlier. And I can remember when I first saw that picture, I went, oh, he's graffitiing. And I could just feel, oh no. He actually is using chalk. It's actually chalk paint. So it has that sort of look to it. And same with the flares. Oh, flares. They're not really doing any harm. And they were just campaigning on things like getting universities to divest. But they were experimenting for 2 years with these very visual, very disruptive tactics. This is another one they did. This was during the UK election. So this is just one person. This is Gail Bradbrook. So she's another main person now from Extinction Rebellion, a scientist. And this is a one-person protest. Again, she's used the chalk spray. They just wash it off afterwards. And this was at the Murdoch Press. Got 170,000 views on YouTube. So again, one person, 1 hour, 170,000 views. They're very clever at just getting that visual impact. So in 2018, they decided, instead of all this just campaigning on these small issues, they were going to campaign on the climate emergency, and they started doing talks, so talks like this, all over the UK, and they would tell people it's really, really bad, and then they would say, and what are you prepared to do? And they found about 20% of the people they reached were willing to get arrested. And they told them that they were building towards October last year. And they started setting up these affinity groups, non-violent direct action groups, and they started just practicing blocking roads. So there's, say, a group of 10 or 20 that's had training, and they're just practicing blocking the road. They also went to Greenpeace in particular, who would not support them and would not do a call out, and they did a peaceful occupation. You know, Gandhi, before he did the Salt March, went to the British in India and gave them a flower and said, unless you agree, we're going to rebel. So this is a bit like that. They went in a friendly sort of way and blockaded them and gave them flowers and sat there for 2 hours and said, why aren't you supporting us? So then in October they did go to the government and say, if you don't declare a climate emergency, we're going to rebel. And Greta came down to launch it. Also George Monbiot was there. Some Labor politicians and some Greens politicians were there right from the start, although they're careful not to line up with any political party. And they kept on with doing these really quite creative, impactful, and just slightly off-putting actions. So they had ones with people's hands glued, super glued, to windows. This is Gail, having climbed up onto a revolving door, and she's now just painted frack off and the Extinction Rebellion sign. These again are people with their hands glued. So quite disruptive. They also went to the BBC. I used to think they only did the banner outside. They actually blockaded the BBC. They blocked all the entrances. And same thing, just to say, why are you not taking this seriously? Since then they've gone back and they actually sit out there and they do surveys of the journalists and ask them whether they think the BBC is doing enough. And from that they've got these amazing media contacts. And they actually have had incredibly favourable and prominent coverage from the BBC since then. And then, of course, the UK government didn't declare a climate emergency, and much as you probably heard nothing in Australia, on the 17th of November they blocked 5 bridges and shut down London for about half a day. I think it was 83 arrests, and they had hundreds and hundreds of people who were willing to be arrested. And there's a video of Roger Hallam talking to the police saying, can't you arrest them quicker? And the police saying, no, we haven't got enough vans. So 83 were arrested. And then there was a bit of a Christmas lull. Oh, before the Christmas lull, this is right from the start. They had the support of a former archbishop and all sorts of faith groups, scientists, a lot of very respectable people, as well as the ratbags you might expect. And they picked up the council campaign. So suddenly there were dozens of councils around the UK that declared. There were others we didn't know, but they were working on it in Quebec. There was 100 or something that all declared in Quebec. And now I think we're up to 400. It's gone from just, I don't know, 20 or 30 or 40 before Christmas to 400. Going exponential, that's what we like to see. Again, this is another of their really creative actions. This is blood of our children. And it's non-toxic, but it looks pretty much like blood. And they had, again, just dozens of people, all quite willing to be arrested, and they just poured blood on the streets. The police knew they were quite ready to be arrested, actually didn't arrest anybody. But again, front page of the Guardian. This clever, slightly confronting action seems to work. Now this is the most recent one. This one got on the radio news in Australia. 13 people who went into the House of Commons while they were discussing Brexit. Stripped off, obviously. That one's dressed as an elephant, so it was the elephant in the room, right? And they were just calling out, you're wasting our time, we're going to die, when are you going to act? And so it was not only front page in the UK, it went around the world. 13 people with a creative action and the courage to get undressed and risk arrest. So, as of Monday, it's now the International Rebellion in 30 plus countries, including Australia. And these are the slides I was adding at the last minute because this has all just been happening, yesterday and today, Monday. They have shut down London for 2 days now. They're going to the 3rd day. They've got 5 locations, and I can hardly sleep for trying to follow what's happening. They were just arresting people in the hundreds during their last night, which was our yesterday. But then they actually put at the most vulnerable location, which was Waterloo Bridge, they actually parked a truck across, which is also where they've got their sound system, and then a whole lot of people locked on underneath it so that they couldn't move the truck. So they had it very well planned. Like initially it was just a little festival atmosphere, but as the first few hundred were getting arrested, I don't know if it's a few hundred, but it's more than 100 now, they have these other creative tactics that they're using because their aim is to shut down London long enough that the UK government negotiates. This is Roger Hallam's view. It's not so much use to actually try and target a company, like you can maybe stop Adani by targeting the companies, but why not just go straight to targeting the government and just take control of the central city, disrupt it so much that they come to the negotiating table. Who knows if it's going to work, but it's very interesting watching it. One of the things that's happening, I don't know whether this is it or not, is there's some older people who are offering themselves for arrest and saying, take us before you take the younger people, but there's all these younger people who are there as well. It's got an incredible festival atmosphere. There's all these artists and musicians and all sorts of incredibly creative people that are all there supporting them. which again has this sort of quality to it, is they actually vandalised the Shell company, because what they're trying to do is they're trying to have this, I don't know, 8 or 10 of them did it. They're trying to get a severe enough charge to be held in a jury trial instead of by a magistrate. So one of them actually did smash the glass revolving door, and that's why they're doing this, I think, with paint rather than chalk, because they're trying to get the day in court. And their aim is to be like the suffragettes, where people go, oh, I don't think they really should have done that with the Shell building, but I agree with what they're trying to do, trying to get. So their demands are tell the truth, declare a climate emergency, and establish a people's assembly. People get scared about declaring an emergency and losing control, because declaring an emergency can be like a totalitarian move to take away liberty. People's assembly sounds like sort of a wussy kind of thing, but what it is a randomly selected panel, a bit like jury duty, and it actually has been used successfully in quite a number of parts of the world, including in South Australia, to decide about the nuclear dump, and in Ireland to frame the question for an abortion referendum. And what they tend to find is that ordinary people, with any experts they want to call, can actually make better decisions than politicians who are beholden to this vested interest, and this vested interest, and worried about re-election. So that's why it's people's assembly. The essence of the stance is that you're disruptive but very respectful. So this is from a protest in New Zealand where they shut off the water to the Water and Environment Department, and there was just again about 5 of them locked on, stopping the water. But this woman, she sort of typifies the attitude. Like, yes, I did it. Feel free to arrest it. Feel free to arrest me. I've got nothing against you. You're just doing your job. I'm just doing my job. Here I am. So this idea of sacrifice is very important. That's what seems to shift public opinion, that people are actually willing to sacrifice their liberty in order to do something. And it's very decentralised. As long as you agree with the aims, you can basically go ahead and just do stuff. And as long as you respect the principles. So, we're trying it in Australia. It's hard in Australia because disrupting London has a whole different feel to it than trying to disrupt Canberra. And so, yeah, it's just sort of different and difficult. But anyway, they have done an incredible job so far of leading the way, and are doing an incredible job right now at leading the way. And we're just starting to experiment. We've done banner drops. We're doing lots of training. Like literally, I've done 2. This is my second this week. There's other people doing another 3. That's just in Melbourne. So we're doing the whole outreach thing. We did a little tell the truth thing down at the Murdoch Press. And it's interesting that the very first mention of Extinction Rebellion in Australia was in the Murdoch Press. Not favourable, I would have to say. But anyway, it was a mention. Whereas still, like in the Age this morning, still, like the whole London shut down. It doesn't get a mention, not one paragraph. Got on SBS. I think that's the only mention. So we, in solidarity with London, stopped the road, stopped at Alexandra Parade on Monday, which was kind of scary, especially after the vegans had done their thing. And so we had all the drivers just going quite apoplectic, thinking that they were going to be there for a really long time. We didn't actually stop them for very long. We had people going out and talking to them. I was one of them. And look, a lot of them were pretty okay with it once they understood what it was, and some of them not so much. But it was a very interesting practice. I think we've still got to get clearer in Australia about what exactly we're trying to disrupt and why. And so, in terms of messaging, I think we can't go better than Greta. I don't want your hope, I want you to panic. I want you to feel the fear I feel every day. I want you to act. I want you to act as you would in a crisis. I want you to act as if the house is on fire, because it is. So that's what she's asking. Apparently, they used this quote at a lecture forum with Josh Frydenberg, and he just looked down at his kid. And you can imagine why. There was another forum where the Liberal candidate was asked, all the candidates were asked, who's holding you to account? What do you say to your children? And all the other candidates said, well, you know, to feel okay with my children, I'm doing this, to feel okay. And the Liberal candidate said, my children just care about jobs and growth. Oh, are you sure? I won't even say who she was. There you go. So now we come to the question for you, like the question I had to answer. What do we all want to be remembered for? And I think we all want to be remembered for what we did rather than what we thought of doing but never got round to. And I think we all probably sympathise with Albert Einstein's view that the world is a dangerous place to live, not because of the people who are evil, but because of the people who don't do anything about it. So this is the final little discussion for the evening. It came in the same pairs or threes or whatever it is. Extinction Rebellion needs help. It doesn't necessarily require you to actually get arrested, because for every one person that wants to get arrested, there's 100 people that are needed to support, to do social media, to raise money, to look after the database, to bring the banners to the protest, to do the artwork. So there's help for it, there's roles for everybody, and there is a whole broader climate emergency movement, which just involves things like maybe getting people to put up house signs. And the other really exciting thing is going and getting the candidates to say that they support the Declaration of Climate Emergency, just going up to them, getting them to sign a photo pledge. So there's dozens of roles. Why don't you just get into your little pairs and threes and just explore for a few moments. Okay. So look, a really practical thing you can do is just stay in the loop. I'll pass this around. It's got a column. It's the original Climate Emergency Declaration petition. It's got a column just for keeping in touch about the general climate emergency campaign, which is things like getting the politicians to sign up for house signs, and Extinction Rebellion. If you're really keen, I also have the Extinction Rebellion volunteers sheet, which I can give you, but you might let the others go.
I've got 3, 4.
Yeah, got one for each one. That's it.
I guess
Here's your Extinction Rebellion volunteers. There's also this, which just gives you the Facebook group. There's a private Facebook group for Victoria that you have to actually ask to join, and you've got to answer 2 questions. If you just ask to join and don't answer the 2 questions, we just leave it sitting there forever and never let you in. There's also a website which is a highly secure off-site website, which is a bit clunky. And if you look carefully on the front page and you sign up, there's a forum. So some of the discussion and the organising actually takes place there. There's a Facebook page which has some stuff, but you really should get into the group if you want to know what's going on.